my great pleasure to introduce Professor Geoff Bird as our 22nd Mid-Career Prize Lecturer. Geoff has held posts as professor at the University of Birmingham, Oxford, King's, Birkbeck, and UCL. He's published a very long list of distinguished papers in some of the field's most important journals, including the Annual Review of Psychology, Current Biology, and Biological Psychiatry. Geoff is probably best known for his work, his theoretical work, concerning heterogeneity in emotion processing in autism. He's advanced the theory that emotion processing difficulties often seen in autism are due to alexithymia, a commonly co-occurring condition characterized by difficulties in describing one's own emotions. This theoretical framework has led to a host of important discoveries about how alexithymia impacts a variety of socio-cognitive processes. And in the process of developing this novel theoretical framework, Geoff has also made a number of vital methodological contributions that have improved the rigor across this field. Geoff's theoretical advances have led to a richer understanding of autism with and without alexithymia. And they've also raised awareness of the ways in which these different profiles can influence diagnosis. And I think in the nomination letter, it's not just about your scientific achievements, it's also about your wider contributions. And what really came across was that Geoff is just a wonderful supervisor and mentor. At the time of the nomination, Geoff had supervised 10 PhD students to completion and had mentored 5 postdoctoral fellows, all of whom have remained in and succeeded in academia. Some have gone on to win prizes in their own right, including 2 who have won the EPS Frith Prize, and that's further testament to the quality of the training that he offers. And my own department has benefited from some of that training in the people that we've been able to hire. So Geoff, we are really thrilled to have you as our Mid-Career Prize Lecturer this evening, and are looking forward to what you have to say. Thank you, Geoff.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the EPS. To say it was a shock to get this award is an understatement, and genuinely a huge honour. That's really true. Those of you that know me know that modesty is not one of my many weaknesses, but even I, when looking at the previous EPS award winners, was intimidated and humbled. These include some of my greatest academic heroes. But those of you who know about classification accuracy know that we shouldn't just look at hits when we're trying to work out whether a selection filter is good. We should also look at correct rejections. And it seems that the EPS is doing well there as well. The second thing that immediately occurred to me was that this is kind of not fair to get an award myself, when really I haven't done anything on my own ever. I've not written a single author paper at all. And I've been ridiculously lucky to have just an astonishing set of mentors and collaborators, and this is before you even get to my, I think, best in the world set of students that I've been lucky to have, and postdocs. So this is really for all of us, really. And I guess that my next thought is maybe common to people that receive awards, but certainly something that really worried me was, what on earth am I going to talk about? Because partly due to the exceptional collaborators I've had, we've really looked at lots of different things. We've done theoretical work in many different domains, developed new tests of a lot of stuff, worked with lots of different groups of volunteers. And I was really struggling to try and work out how to make a coherent talk among all of that stuff. And so what I decided to do is to try and identify the key themes in all of this stuff. And actually the most pertinent thing was actually not a theme, but a kind of a standard that I guess we try to live up to. And this standard, I suppose, was best articulated by Frankie and Uta between 25 and 30 years ago now, in what they described as a fine cuts approach to understanding psychopathology. And hopefully I understood this correctly, given they're both in the audience. I think their main points were really arguing for a cognitive model to distinguish between different conditions, to identify latent factors responsible for system clusters, both within and between disorders, and to provide specific testable theories. And although I think originally this was an argument for how to understand psychopathology, I think this is a beautiful framework to understand any way in which people vary. And I think the things that really struck me was this argument for the importance of cognitive models and the specificity and sensitivity in measurement. And I think those two things are, like I said, the standards that we try and hold ourselves to. And I kind of worry, maybe unnecessarily, that these things might be slightly lost in our current big data world of AI, neuroscience, computational modelling. And maybe I'm preaching to the converted already, but I'd like to reiterate the importance of this fine cuts approach. And you might ask why? And I think that's a fair question. And I think cognitive models are really important for sort of three main reasons. The first is scientific outreach. Taxpayers fund our work, and whether they should do or not is a matter of debate. But I guess if you want to communicate what we're working on and what we've found, I think cognitive models are just easier to explain. Talking about patterns of neuronal firing and interactions between neural areas or complicated mathematical models, most of the time I don't understand them. Whereas most of the people I know that are not scientists can understand words we use for thinking and memories and those kind of things. So I think cognitive models are useful for that. I think the other thing that they're useful for is to give descriptions of a whole system. So I think if we start to try and describe a whole system at the levels of individual neurons, we're going to run into the problems that deep neural networks have, this interpretability problem, where we know they can do stuff, and we know what individual elements within that network can do, but we can't really describe what the whole system is doing because it's just too complicated. And I think it's probably a very high-level abstraction, but cognitive models allow us to look at a whole system. I think the other thing they do is allow us to chop up different psychological processes into their constituent parts. Some of the work that we've been doing is looking at face recognition and trying to chop that into the different parts of it: face perception, face matching, face memory. And the goal is always to try and find the constituent elements of those big psychological processes. And I think these are really important when we try and find genetic or neurological correlates of these processes. It's much more likely that we're going to be successful for these small specific subcomponents rather than something massive like face recognition. So this is why I think it's useful. And what I'm going to try and do is to try and show how it's been useful to me throughout my career using a non-systematic and non-comprehensive review of what I've done so far. Prisma guidelines be damned. So I was incredibly lucky, really, to do my PhD with Celia Hayes on imitation and mirror neurons. This was a BBS paper that we wrote after my PhD with the other people in the lab, all of whom were Celia students. And I wrote this on the description of myself. I said that Celia had taught me how to think, and I guess we'd probably all agree with that statement. So obviously, if there's any complaints in this talk, please direct them to Celia. We were very lucky, actually, that when we started our PhDs, that Celia had done the hard theoretical work for us. She had made this theory about how it was possible for people to imitate, how we could translate representations of other people's actions that might be encoded in visual or auditory terms, and use them to produce actions, so in terms of muscle contractions, that in some way matched those actions. And we spent a lot of time testing this theory, maybe developing a bit, and trying to develop new experimental paradigms to test the predictions of this model. And I think we were very lucky because this was fine cuts in action. I mean, we were very lucky that Celia's theory specified the nature of the psychological representations that we were dealing with. Not only the information that they held, but the format or the code that that information was in. We also had an idea about how the system develops, the process, the rules about how the system develops, the necessary environmental conditions, and the theory made testifiable, quantifiable, falsifiable predictions. And I think that general question is something that still fascinates me today, how we can relate representations of other people and the self. Is it the case, for example, that in the case of imitation, developing improved motor control and motor experience allows us to understand other people's actions? Does it work for emotions? Does it work for mental states and theory of mind? Is it the case that understanding other people enables us to understand ourselves? Is it the case that we really have separate representations for other people and from the self, or do they become one functioning unit? In terms of the tests, what we are trying to do is to make these process pure. So the test isolates particular psychological processes such that we can understand individual differences on these tests in terms of just one particular process. So I was incredibly lucky to get that training in the fine cuts approach as described by Frankie and Inter. So then I moved to a couple of rising young stars, Uta and Chris Frith, to look at autism. And one of the things that we looked at was this paradox that's been referred to a few times, where a lot of researchers in autism charities, describe people with autism as having problems with emotion. So problems with emotion recognition, emotion reciprocity, and empathy. But yet, speaking to autistic people and reading blogs and things, we found that a significant proportion of people with autism, about half, said this is just not true. And their family members said it also is not true. And so we have this paradox. Why is it that there's this kind of consensus view that autism was characterized by emotional problems, but autistic people themselves said it wasn't true? And importantly, when you looked at the results of scientific studies, so this was a qualitative review of studies of facial emotion recognition in autism, what it showed that there was about 50% of studies that seemed to suggest that there were problems recognizing emotional expressions in autism, but 50% showing there's no problem whatsoever. And this paradox is interesting, both in understanding heterogeneity in autism and in trying to work out what the hell is going on in the literature. And the condition that you've already heard described that we thought might be interesting was this condition that's known as alexithymia, which is characterized by problems in working out, identifying one's own emotions and describing those emotions, but also difficulty distinguishing feelings from arousal, from other bodily states. So people with alexithymia might know that something nasty is going on, but they're not sure whether they're sad, angry, or afraid, or they're not sure whether they're tired or angry. So why is this interesting? Well, from this deep question about self-representations influence other questions, this is interesting because if I'm alexithymic and I don't know what it means to be afraid or angry or sad, I don't know what those emotions are, can I really understand them in other people? Can I recognize their expressions? Do I know what actions those emotions predict? So theoretically, this was an interesting question for me. Practically, it's interesting because about 7% of the non-autistic population are alexithymic, but 50% of the autistic population. And therefore we wondered whether alexithymia might explain the heterogeneity within the autistic population, but also explain the mixed results we've seen in literature. So the argument is that any particular study, any particular sample of autistic volunteers, we can have three different scenarios. We could have a situation where actually our sample of autistic individuals are almost entirely alexithymic, in which case we might predict we'll find differences between our autistic group and our control group. That's A there. Or C, by chance, we might have a group of autistic volunteers who none of whom are alexithymic, in which case we wouldn't expect to see any difference between our autistic and control group. And we might have B, where results are weak and hard to replicate. So this was the idea. How did we do it? Well, really quite simply. We just used non-representative sampling. We had our autistic volunteers, our non-autistic volunteers, and we just made sure that those groups were matched on alexithymia. Half of those groups were highly alexithymic, half of the groups weren't alexithymic, and so we could just unconfound these things. We could compare this group with this group to find effects of autism controlling for alexithymia, this group with this group to find effects of alexithymia controlling for autism. All kind of very simple. And I think at the start what we wanted to focus on was this idea, prevalent in a lot of people, that people with autism are not empathic, they don't have empathy. Our volunteers told us that this was really damaging stereotype, stopped them volunteering, they had problems at work because of this stereotype, and to be honest, we knew it wasn't true. And so thinking about empathy in autism and alexithymia, we needed to do this kind of fine cuts approach. We needed a cognitive model of empathy. And so we come up with this very, very cartoon model about how empathy might occur. And this is really kind of theory agnostic when it comes to empathy. And the idea is that in order for someone to be empathic, the first thing they need to do is to attend to the relevant parts of the world. The parts of the world that signal other people's emotional states. So their facial expressions, for example. Once people are doing that, then it needs to be the case that they can recognise the emotional state that that person's in. Are they in pain? Are they upset? Are they angry? Once you've done that, then working out that somebody's in pain, for example, or that they're upset, you need to represent their emotion, and for empathy to have occurred, then recognising that person's upset needs to produce a causal change in your own emotion. And under some theories of empathy, you need to be able to represent that your own emotion has been caused by somebody else. So that's our kind of cartoon model of how empathy happens. And so what we decided to do was to use the same approach to investigate the contributions of autism and alexithymia at each one of these levels, including empathy itself. And at each one of these levels, it was alexithymia and not autism that predicted atypicalities. And we hope that was useful from a kind of a clinical point of view, remove some of these damaging stereotypes about autism that we were told are particularly problematic for the autistic community. But along the way, we continuously had to adopt this fine cuts approach to come up with new cognitive models at each one of these levels and new tests. And just to take one of the examples at this level, we were very interested in recognition of emotion from faces in autism. And so in this paper we used these quite strange stimuli. So we morphed these stimuli down the bottom, and you can see at one end of this morph continuum you've got one identity, Harold, expressing a particular emotion, anger, and at the other end you've got a different identity, Felix, expressing a different emotion, disgust. And we're morphing across both emotion and identity. So these stimuli were useful because they allow us to carry out 4 tests to do with faces. So 2 that are about identity, because we wanted to check whether there's just general face processing impairments in autism or alexithymia. They were more controlled experiments. But also do 2 experiments about emotions, emotional expressions, in our autistic and alexithymic volunteers. The first we called the emotion perception task. And what we asked people to do, we presented them with 2 of these stimuli, so let's imagine either end, and we just asked them, are these emotional expressions the same or different? Now crucially, what this requires people to be able to do is to recognise that these expressions are from a particular class of expressions. So this is from a particular class of expressions that we would call disgust. That's from the class that we would call anger. But crucially, doesn't require you to recognise it, to apply a label. So just to be able to know that they are different. So that's the perceptual test. The recognition test asks them to label it. So taking one of these stimuli and saying, what emotion is this? What we were able to show was that alexithymia was related to a very specific deficit in recognising emotions. So they were able to show, or to say, that those two emotions were different. What they weren't able to do is to say that the one on the left is anger and the one on the right is disgust. Which is really quite interesting when you think about their own impairments in how emotions feel is predicting their ability to label these emotional expressions. So I think this was interesting on a theoretical level, but actually it enabled us to look at some other research on early neural responses to emotional facial expressions. So I was really interested in this paradigm. This is an EEG paradigm, FPVS, fast periodic visual stimulation. Excuse me. And the way that this paradigm tended to work, before we got our grubby hands on it, is to present a stream of neutral facial expressions on a particular identity, and then present an oddball. So here that identity is changed from a neutral expression to a disgusted expression. Then you present more neutral, oddball, neutral, oddball, neutral, oddball. This is done extremely quickly. And you measure the EEG signal. And what you do is you analyze your data as a function of frequency. And what you're looking for is a signal at the base stream, these neutral faces, and the oddball stream. Why on earth do you care about this? So what you're trying to do is to characterize what information is carried by these early neural responses to emotional facial expressions. So if these responses just signal faces, then what should we expect? Well, we should expect very high signal at the frequency specified by all of the faces, neutral and disgusted. If these early neural responses distinguish between the two classes of stimuli, the neutral face and the disgust expression, then we should expect to see two peaks when we analyze the frequency. We should expect to see a peak at the base frequency and a peak at the oddball frequency. And that's exactly what you do see. It's very hard to see these oddball peaks. There's simply less power. There's only one stimulus there at that frequency. And so this is really useful. It allows us to look at these very, very quick, very early neural responses. But the problem is, using this standard paradigm, you've really got no idea what that oddball signal represents. So what it could represent is just a change. You've got neutral, 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 disgust, so it could just be signaling a change. It could just be signaling that the face is no longer neutral. And you can imagine evolutionary reasons why we might have a signal which says this face is now not neutral. It could be signaling the presence of an emotion. It could be signaling the presence of a particular class of emotional expression, or at the highest level, it could be signaling the presence of disgust. It could be related to emotion recognition. So we decided to change the paradigm in quite a fundamental way. So it's the same basic design, but actually now the identity of the face and the emotion portrayed on that face changes on every single trial. Crucially, at the oddball frequency, we're presenting disgusted facial expressions on a new identity each time. Why is this useful? Well, now we can start to narrow down what this oddball signal represents. It can't be a change signal anymore, because there's a change in every trial. It can't be a not neutral signal, because none of these faces are neutral. It can't be an emotion, because all stimuli are emotional, which leaves us with two options. Either this is a signal representing a specific class of emotional expression that happen to be disgusted faces, or it could be, at the highest level, this recognition of disgust. So what's useful is, remember our previous experiment that found that alexithymic individuals can do this recognition of particular classes of emotional expression. They can recognize that these two things are different, these two emotional expressions. What they can't do is recognize that one's disgust and one's anger. And so we can run this paradigm in our electrothymic volunteers, and what we were able to do is to show that there was a crucial frontal source that was absent in our electrothymic individuals, suggesting that that frontal signal is related to the recognition of disgust. So this work on electrothymia, like I said, is hopefully kind of useful clinically and kind of useful theoretically. But we kept getting asked the same question, and is actually asked today in the symposium. How do you fix electrothymia? I'm not a clinical psychologist, but not having expertise has never held me back before. So I turn this question around into how do we become lexithymic? How do we develop emotional awareness? And obviously, lots of greats of the psychology in the psychology literature have addressed this question. And we heard about this earlier on. What's interesting is that all theories of emotion, literally all of them, specify a role for interoception, the perception of internal bodily signals. So it seemed like the first thing we should do is to try and investigate whether alexithymic individuals show impaired interoception. One of those things that I thought would be easy. I think it was about 10, 12 years. The first thing we did was to look at the way that interoception is typically measured. And what people normally do is to look at the perception of heartbeats, so cardiac interoceptive accuracy. And there were two main tasks, in fact there still are, two main tasks that we used. The first one is known as the heartbeat counting task. It's the most simple thing in the world. People are asked just to specify to count the number of times their heart beats in a particular period. And their count is compared to an objective record of the number of times that their heart beat during that period using ECG or something. Obvious problem with that is that if you know your heart rate is 60 beats per minute, or whatever it is, you can actually perform perfect on this task even if you can't perceive your heartbeat at all. There's a slightly better task, in fact a lot better task, the heartbeat detection task, and this is good because knowing your heart rate is not useful at all in this task. What happens is that an objective device is used to measure the contraction of the heart. So here we're measuring the R wave, that's what's represented by the wiggly line. And the subject hears tones either at what the experimenter decides is the point at which they should perceive their heartbeat, so experimenters define synchronously with their heartbeat, or at a later interval that the experimenter decides is not in sync with their heartbeat. And they're asked to say which one of these two tones is in sync with their heartbeat. This is problematic because there's massive individual differences at the point at which people perceive their heartbeat relative to that R wave signal. And so actually the task is susceptible to false negatives, to deciding that somebody is not interoceptive when in fact they are, to the opposite problem to the heartbeat counting task, where you might get false positives, so you decide people are interoceptive when they're not. So we wanted to design a new task that had the benefits of the heartbeat detection task, in that it wasn't susceptible to knowledge of heart rates. Most people with an Apple Watch or something like that now know what their heart rate is. And where we turn the problem with the heartbeat detection task, these individual differences in the delay from the R wave, where you perceive your heartbeat, wanted to use that to our advantage rather than that to be a problem. So we developed a smartphone app. This is the bane of my life. The task is called the phase adjustment task. Making it work on a smartphone is a pain. So we get people to hold their phone like this, so their fingers across the camera and the flash, and we use this to detect their heartbeats. And at the simplest level, this task, all it does is when the phone detects the pulse wave in their finger, so it detects that a heartbeat has happened, we just present tones. So crucially, on every trial, those tones are at a random delay after we detect the heartbeat. And the participants are asked to twiddle, technical term, this dial, rotate it, until they judge that those tones are synchronous with the heartbeats they perceive. So they do this on each of something like 17 or 20 trials, can't remember exactly which. What we do is we analyse the delay between our detected heartbeats and the point at which they say the tones are synchronous with their heartbeats. And we do this on every single trial, and we measure the consistency of the selected delays across trials. So what you'd expect to happen if somebody could perceive their heartbeats, you'd expect them to continuously select a similar sort of delay across trials, because there is a signal that they can perceive, and they can make sure that the tones are in phase or synchronous with their heartbeats. For somebody that's not interoceptive, this should be everywhere. Why should it be everywhere? Because we're asking them to do a task which is absolutely impossible. We're asking them to synchronise two signals, one of which they can't feel. So we spent a long time, a lot of money, a lot of emotional effort in making this smartphone task, and we thought this was great. We can now find the problem with alexithymia. The problem is that our initial analysis, and probably haven't done this to the full extent yet, suggests there is no relationship between alexithymia and scores on this new PAT measure. The problem is that every time we ask alexithymic individuals using questionnaires that we've designed, and qualitative interviews, everything else, they tell us that they are really bad at this. So what's going on? Well, it could be the case that they do have impaired interoceptive accuracy, but it's in another domain. It's not in cardiac. Maybe, maybe not. But maybe this distinction between what they report their ability to be, and our objective measure of their ability, this discrepancy between those two things, is indication of poor metacognition. They're not aware of their ability. Their reports of their ability doesn't match our objective measure. And this is interesting because there are lots of theoretical arguments for links between metacognition and theory of mind, the ability to represent one's own or other people's mental states. And this is also of relevance to autism. So there's been this idea from Uta and Frankie and Alan Leslie originally that the thing about autism that's really one of the key defining characteristics is the problem with theory of mind. Now, we know that there's a lot of alexithymic people in the autistic population, so it was possible that this would explain weaker theory of mind in the autistic population. I didn't think that was true for lots of reasons, but I thought we should check it out. So, I guess most of you know what metacognition is, thinking about thinking, cognition about cognition. Theory of mind is normally defined as the ability to represent mental states of oneself and others. It's normally tested by the accuracy of mental state inferences. Can you accurately work out what someone else is thinking? Now, when it comes to the relationship between theory of mind and metacognition, there's two main classes of theory. The first says that theory of mind and metacognition are served by the same system. Some theories say they're the same thing. Other theories say they are distinct, but they are subserved by the same system. Another class of theory suggests that metacognition is necessary for theory of mind, but not vice versa. So if you've got impaired metacognition, you must have impaired theory of mind, but it's not the case if you've got impaired theory of mind, you must have impaired metacognition. So the way people address this question is normally just to give a test of metacognition, a test of theory of mind, and just see if they're correlated. And the problem is the evidence is about as equivocal as you can get. Just as many studies show a correlation as fail to show a correlation. So in something else that we thought might be easy, and really wasn't, we decided to apply the ever faithful, ever useful fine cuts approach to this question about theory of mind and metacognition. And what was clear was that there was existing really brilliant work on what we should expect the consequences of the theory of mind failure to be, again, mostly by Frankie Uta and Alan Leslie, but potentially less work on a psychological model of how we make mental state inferences. And it seemed really crucial for us to have such a model to explain why any one population might be impaired, so whether that's autistic, alexithymic, whoever, but also to explain why some people are better at this than other people. And I guess the useful thing about such a psychological model of theory of mind is that we might be able to say why and how, particularly, metacognition and theory of mind might be related. And the other part of this fine cuts approach is not just the cognitive model about how things happen, but also these tests. So I guess the problem, and we've heard this earlier on from Frankie, is that lots of tests of theory of mind have problems. They're not very sensitive, first of all, because most neurotypical people are just too good at things like false belief reasoning. It's very hard to find any individual differences. They're not very sensitive. Lots aren't specific. They're hard not because the theory of mind component is hard, but because things like they have lots of language demands or executive function demands. And so that's a problem. But I think the thing that's really quite puzzling, why we haven't addressed this before, is that actually for most tests, we don't know what the right answer is. So we want to test the accuracy of mental state inferences, but we don't have ground truth data. So think about something like the reading the mind and the eyes test. As far as I understand, this was developed by 8 people looking at a magazine and deciding among themselves what this expression is. So actually, when we're asking, are people accurate in making mental state inferences, what we're really asking is, do they make the same inferences as those 8 neurotypical people? I assume they were neurotypical. So we wanted to kind of solve these problems. And the way we did it was to come up with this theory called mind space. And really, at first blush, at first principles, this theory is so simple it's actually embarrassing to even describe it. And really it follows from this trivial observation that mental states are a product of the mind that gave rise to them. What do I mean by that? I mean, in the same situation, different people have different mental states. So if this is true, then the accuracy with which we can represent people's minds should determine the accuracy of our mental state inference under lots of assumptions, and they're all part of the theory, they're the more complicated bits. So this should be true if it's the case that we use representations of minds when we infer mental states. So this starts to become the basis of a mechanistic theory. And we heard about this theory in talks earlier on, but in case you didn't see them, we basically stole the idea of face space from all the clever face researchers. The concept of face space is that we have this multi-dimensional space in our minds where each dimension represents one way in which faces can be individuated. This is thought to be experience dependent, and the idea is that when we learn a facial identity, what we're doing is learning a location or a vector within this multi-dimensional space. So we just nicked this idea, and we have this concept of mind space, which is the same kind of thing. It's a multi-dimensional space where each dimension represents a way in which minds can be individuated, so traits. You don't actually need to buy this way of representing minds. The point is that we use minds when we're making mental state inferences. So the idea is that we are pitching mental state inference as, you could call this a kind of a Bayesian process where, it hasn't really got to be Bayesian, but just Bayes is cool, where what people are trying to do is estimate the probability of specific mental states conditioned upon the context that person is in and their location in mind space. Why is this useful? Why do I think it's important? Well, if we take one of the kind of classic theory of mind tests, these kind of false belief vignettes, we have this vignette where we've got 2 characters, Anne and Walter. Both of them eat half their chocolate bar. They put the rest away in the cupboard. They then go out to play in the sun. There's a 3rd character, Sarah, who comes in, opens the cupboard, sees the chocolate bars, puts them in the fridge. It's a hot day, they're going to melt in the cupboard. And the question we ask about Anne and Walter is, where are they going to look for their chocolate when they come back into the house? Now, the standard correct answer is that they're going to look in the cupboard. Their chocolate has been moved, they didn't see that it's been moved, they got a false belief, so they should look in the cupboard. And that's kind of fine, but let's think about what we know about these people. Well, what we know is that Anne's memory is pretty good. When she comes back into the house, she's going to remember where she left her chocolate, and so she's going to go in the cupboard, and we're going to give the response that would normally be considered correct. But if we know that Walter is incredibly forgetful, then actually we might think to ourselves, well, when Walter comes back into the house, they're going to forget they left their chocolate bar in the cupboard, and they're going to go to the fridge. Why? Because the fridge is where you keep chocolate, especially in hot sunny days. Now, that could be the right answer. In these classic tests, we don't know because there isn't a ground truth. We don't know what that character was really thinking because they don't really have thoughts. And so, if we think about this theory as a whole, we now have a way to explain some of the individual differences in theory of mind and explain potential reasons why some groups might fail to make accurate mental state inferences. So there's a few potential reasons here. People might have an inaccurate model of how traits vary with each other. Their mind space might be inaccurate. They might be very poor at locating a target in mind space, very poor at working out what kind of person or what kind of mind a person has. They might not know how to translate location within mind space, so a particular type of person, into the probability of specific mental states. They might just not bother to do this. They might have a low propensity to locate somebody in mind space when inferring mental states. The last two are interesting. I'll talk about those in a bit more detail later. But actually it might be the case that we shouldn't really think of theory of mind as a general ability. It might be the case that we are better able to make mental state inferences, we're more accurate in those inferences when people are like us, when they have similar minds as us. And this effect might be moderated by self-awareness. I'll talk through those later on. So now we've done one half of the fine cuts approach. We've got this cognitive model. It's a bit simple, but we have it. Now we need a test. So this is what we came up with. So we had two people, and they were carrying out a practice job interview. So there's a candidate and an interviewer. And we gave both of these two characters, real people obviously, an IQ test, the WACE, and a personality test, the hexacope. And we asked them to carry out this practice job interview. And halfway through, we stopped them and gave them a long list of questions about what they were thinking. So we might ask the interviewer whether they thought, the candidate thought, that they were doing well, for example. We also asked questions at the end, asked the same set of questions at the end of each interview. This was all video recorded, obviously not the people's answers to those questions. And we got groups of participants to watch these videos. And while they were watching, halfway through we stopped. At the same point we'd stopped the job interview when it was actually going on. And we asked our participants about the traits of both the interviewer and the candidates. How smart are they? What's their personality? And we also asked them what they're thinking, gave them the same set of questions. Does the interviewer think that the candidate thinks that they're doing well, for example? We then carried on, they're allowed to carry on watching the second half of the interview, and then at the end we asked the same questions again. Questions about the character's traits and questions about their thoughts. So this is the task, and obviously what we can do is compare the accuracy of the trait inferences with the real data. And we can look at the accuracy of the mental state inferences because, again, we've got real data, we've got ground truth. So what should the theory predict? Let's step back from the task for the moment and think in the abstract. So here we have a very simple two-dimensional mind space with just two personality dimensions, extroversion and conscientiousness. And we have a particular character here, and we've located her within our mind space as someone who's very conscientious and who's very, very extrovert. And we're trying to predict the probability that she intends to do her homework this weekend, given that there's a huge party. Now, what we might do is look at where she is and think, although she's very conscientious, she's incredibly extrovert, and this is, one party, the big party of the year. Actually, we think the likelihood that she intends to do her homework, given this party, is actually pretty small. So we might assign a low probability to that mental state. If we continue to learn more information about this lady, and we decide that we got this wrong, and we move her in our mind space, such that we now think she's actually an introvert, we should update our estimate of the likelihood that she intends to do work given the party. She's an introvert, she doesn't like parties. And crucially, the degree to which she's moved in our mind space should predict the degree to which we update our inference about her mental state. When it comes to accuracy, if actually we were originally correct, and she is not introvert, she's actually very extrovert, then the degree to which we are wrong in terms of her trait inferences should determine the degree to which we make inaccurate mental state inferences, depending on a number of assumptions. So, hopefully, this interview task should solve the sensitivity problem. It's very hard to do. Solve the ground truth problem, and it gives us information about trait perception, the ability to locate somebody in mind space, trait inference, and mental state inference, and we can look at the relationship between trait inferences and mental state inferences across time points from time 1 to time 2, and we can compare it against our ground truth data. And the theory makes two kind of obvious predictions. The first, as we've just gone through, is that updates in trait inference, moving someone within our mind space, should predict updates in mental state inference. And if we're making errors in trait inference, we should also make errors in mental state inference. And that's what the data shows. So fine, this task seems to be working, the cognitive model seems to be okay, but let's go back to our big question, which is this relationship between theory of mind and metacognition. Like I said, we've got these two existing theories. The first one, that theory of mind and metacognition are served by the same system. The second, that metacognition is necessary for theory of mind, but not vice versa. This new model, mind space, potentially just the provision of any cognitive model, provides a third option, and the interview task provides a way to test it. What is this third option? Well, here's a kind of a cartoon to explain this third option. So this lady is trying to infer the mental states of this gentleman, and as our prior research shows, she uses inferences about this person's traits to infer those mental states. Now, she will make those trait inferences, and she'll have a different degree of confidence about those trait inferences. So she might be very sure this person's compassionate, but actually not sure at all that the person's ambitious. What she should do, if she's rational, if she's optimal, is she should weight the degree to which she uses those trait inferences to make her mental state inferences as a function of her confidence. Things she's incredibly sure about, she should use to make the mental state inferences. Things she's not sure about, she shouldn't use. Now, you can see why metacognition now is going to be useful. Because by definition, somebody with good metacognition, their confidence reflects their accuracy. So if they're confident in their judgments of somebody's level of compassion, they're likely to be accurate about those. And so using those judgments are likely to be useful. It's going to be optimal. Whereas when they have low confidence, about degree of ambition there, it's likely that they're going to be making errors for those judgments, and so they shouldn't use it. So somebody with good metacognition should weight those inferences appropriately. Someone with poor metacognition, by definition, their confidence doesn't reflect their accuracy. And so they're going to use those trait inferences in a non-optimal manner. So we needed to test the metacognition, and it needed to be in the same domain as our other task. And so we just made a very simple new task where we presented short videos, 30-second videos, of 21 people, asked people to rate these people on 6 different personality traits, and to give us their level of confidence, so we could calculate the degree to which their confidence tracks their accuracy, our measure of metacognition. We also gave the interview task. And what we were able to show, really quite clearly, I guess, is that as people's metacognitive ability improves, their errors in their mental state inferences go down. So good metacognition, really useful. What we were able to show was that our mechanistic explanation of why this should happen was supported, such that those with good metacognition showed optimal weighting of their trait inferences when they were making their mental state inferences. So now we can start to develop something fine-cutsy, something, a cognitive model of why somebody might start making good mental state inferences, why they might be good at theory of mind tests. So one is they're good at making trait inferences, and secondly is they've got good metacognition, such that they use those trait inferences appropriately when they're making mental state inferences. What about some of the other predictions of the theory, though? So I said that similarity and self-perception might also be useful. Why might similarity be useful? Well, this is our person again, our mentalizer. And she's got an idea of her personality. She thinks she's not very conscientious, very agreeable, and about in the middle of extroversion and introversion. She also knows what she tends to do in different situations. In these three situations, you can do one of two things, and she knows what she tends to do. So when she meets somebody else, and she's trying to work out what traits they have, what she can do is see how they act in those particular situations. And if they do the same things that she does, then she can have a very good model of their personality. She can have very high confidence in her judgments. And as we've seen, both of those two things should lead to accurate mental state inferences. Also, lots of prior theorists have suggested that when somebody's like you, you can just ignore this complicated working out what kind of person they are and how those traits might predict the mental states they're going to have. And you can just say, if I was in that situation, what would I think? And you can use yourself as a model. And obviously, the degree to which you can do this depends on similarity. So similarity should be very useful. If you've got somebody where actually their behaviour matches sometimes, doesn't match, then what you're going to end up with is really no model for their personality, and you're going to have no confidence in the judgments that you're making, and so you should have poor mental state inferences. But there's something interesting which should moderate this process, which is the degree to which you have an accurate perception of your own character. So actually, if you have poor self-awareness, you could even describe this as actually metacognitive, but your model of your character is incorrect, but you have a good model of how character should predict the likelihood of mental states, then it should be the case that recognizing that someone is the same as you is actually going to be counterproductive, because where you think you are in mind space is actually not where you really are. And so what we predict is that there should be an effective similarity such that you're better at making mental state inferences for people who are like you, but this should be moderated by the accuracy of self-perception. And that's exactly what we find both for the short videos in our metacognitive task and for the longer videos. So people are like you, better able to make mental state inferences unless you have poor self-perception. So now we can do a bit better when it comes to our model of theory of mind, or making accurate mental state inferences. We can show that similarity improves your ability to make these trait inferences, but this effect is moderated by the accuracy of your self-perception. So this is all good. We're starting to make progress in terms of specifying a cognitive model of theory of mind. But I was talking before about emotions, not mental states, not cognitive mental states. And so what we tried to do is to see whether this general model would also apply for emotion inferences. rather than working out what people are thinking. We used a similar kind of experimental topic. It wasn't a job interview, experimental task. It wasn't a job interview, it was people engaged in a conversation designed to engender a close relationship quickly. But the useful thing about this experimental situation was that, one, it's about emotions, and that's relevant to alexithymia, more than just non-emotional mental states. But it allows us to test two further predictions of the mind space theory. And these are that people should make better mental state, in this case emotional, inferences, if they understand how position in mind space, so the type of person somebody is, predicts the likelihood of certain emotions, and this propensity prediction. That people that can be bothered to work out the type of person somebody is and to apply their trait emotion maps should make better emotion inferences. So we had to use an additional task, this trait emotion mapping task, where we asked people just to give us a number. What's the relationship between a particular personality trait and the likelihood of certain emotions? So here you've got altruism and being relaxed most of the time. One of the others was being friendly and being happy. Now what's useful about this is that unlike the mental state, the interview task, the mental states we used before, we've now got ground truth correlations between the type of person somebody is and the likelihood of their emotions, because we've got this huge data set, 307,000 people, that have rated, they've done these personality tests, and they've told us the likelihood of certain emotions. So we can measure people's accuracy. So what we found when we looked at this was that these three factors, we've already shown that the accuracy of trait inferences is important, but these two new additional factors are also significant, and actually combining these three things together means that we can explain a lot of these, of the variance in emotion inference ability. So all these things, predictions, seem to be borne out by the results, which is great. And I think hopefully this is highlighted in the conclusions of my non-systematic review, was that Uta, Frank and Celia were right all along. We really do need cognitive models. We really do need these sensitive and specific tests, and we're trying to aim for these process pure tests that just test a particular, very specific form of psychological process. But when it comes to the bigger question about how self-representations and other representations are related, whether knowing more about yourself helps you to understand other people, vice versa, whether we have these specific processes, I think the thing that I hope to address a long time ago now, during my PhD and onwards, we haven't actually made much process, because at each stage we've had to apply this fine cuts process to get better tests, get better models. But hopefully I've convinced you that combining this approach, which might be seen as kind of old-fashioned box and arrows type approach, with the core neuroscience and computational modelling, sounds like the way forward to me. I'd like to say thanks to a billion people. I don't have time to do so, and I couldn't fit all their photos on here. I'm really lucky. I said it before, and it's definitely true. I work with amazing, smart, lovely people. But a special mention to Caroline, who organised the symposium. Unfortunately can't be here. I think she's on at least half my papers, and she's always the clever one. The paper that we're both on. So thanks to those people, and thanks to you for listening.